Our story today deals with we're moving into the 18th century, the last period in this phase of our course. And we will first be looking at lands within the sphere of the Tsardom of Muscovy and then Russian Empire. And then at the very end, the lands of Ukraine that remained within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. With the end of the tenure as hetman of Ivan Mazepa, the failure of his immediate successor, Philip Orlik, to provoke a revolt on the right bank in 1711. After that date, and that's why I have it on the board, Ukrainian territories remained divided between three states: Muscovy, then Russian Empire, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Ottoman Empire. A continuation, more or less, of what we had in the 17th century. Within those territories that were under the rule of the Muscovy and the Russian Empire, the most important of them were the Hetmanate, Sloboda Ukraine, Zaporozhye, and certainly the Hetmanate. They were within Muscovy, most of the right bank, Volhynia, Podolia, and Galicia within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and to the south, the Crimean Khanate within the framework of the Ottoman Empire. Here, as I said, we will be speaking of those territories within Muscovy and Russia. And the story that we're going to be look at unfolds in three decades: the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s. And what is that story? That is the loss of self-rule, the loss of autonomy on the part of each of those territories, and their full integration into the rest of the Russian Empire. Peter I's military ventures at the beginning of the 18th century, both extensive, very costly, the Great Northern War against Sweden. But they did set the stage for the transformation of the medieval Tsardom of Muscovy into the Russian Empire. And that transformation actually occurred in the year 1721 when Peter adopted the title Emperor, thereby renaming the Tsardom of Muscovy, with its recently acquired territories, renaming it the Russian Empire. So the Russian Empire, and Russia per se, does not really come into being until 1721. And that change in name was more than symbolic, since under Peter, Muscovy, now Russia, became the leading state in Eastern Europe. Concomitant to that was the decline of Sweden, the former dominant country in the Baltic region, and it was on the decline, so that when in 1721 the second stage of the Great Northern War came to an end, Russia was firmly established on the Baltic Sea, having acquired modern-day Latvia and Estonia and the eastern shores of the Gulf of Finland. Symbolic of the Russian presence there were the spires of St. Petersburg, Tsar Peter's proverbial window to the west at the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland. Begun in 1703, the new capital of the Russian Empire was inaugurated in 1712, hence the very beginning of our period. Now, while Sweden had been effectively checked in the north, Peter's military thrusts against the Ottoman Empire in the south, less decisive. In fact, it was not until the second half of our 18th century that the Russian Empire was finally able to acquire control of the peninsula of Crimea and the northern shores of the Black Sea. But to go back to the earlier part of the century, before that happened, there was a truce, or the beginning of this process, a truce with the Ottoman Empire and peace with Sweden and with Poland after 1721. This now provided the Russian imperial government with kind of respite necessary for it to increase its control over its far-flung domains. Territories in Ukraine, modern-day Ukraine, were a particular object of attention. It was there that the last vestiges of autonomy were to disappear by the second half of the 18th century. And as I said at the outset, it occurred in three stages. Easy to remember the decades of the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s in those three different territories. Let us look a bit at each of these territories and how that process of loss of autonomy and integration took place. First, Sloboda, Ukraine. As you can see by our dates, Sloboda, Ukraine, the first territory in Ukraine to become part of Muscovy. Going back to Kievan times, it was always a sparsely settled frontier region facing the open steppe. Until the Cossack revolts against Poland during the 17th century, first half of the 17th century, a time when many people from both the right bank and the left bank, hoping to find peace and refuge, went eastward to Muscovy. And there they were allowed to establish free settlements called Slobodi, from which the name Sloboda, Ukraine, derives. Slobodi, freedom, free settlement. Beginning in 1638, that decade of ostensible peace before the Khmelnytsky uprising. So beginning in 1638, following each subsequent military and political upheaval in Cossack Ukraine, people fled eastward to what already by then was known as Sloboda, Ukraine. The last major influx of immigrants arrived in the 1730s. That was a result of revolts on the right bank under Polish rule. And so if in the late 17th century, let's say the late 1600s, the population of Sloboda, Ukraine was only about 120,000, a century later, in 1773, toward the end of our period, the number had increased more than fivefold to 660,000. Now, the newcomers who came into Sloboda, Ukraine, brought with them the Cossack system of government, which, as we know, meant both military and civil administrative organization merged. So it's kind of a military state. The Cossacks had a military state under Khmelnytsky, and so that way of creating political structures was brought to the Sloboda, Ukraine. And by 1650, there were 4 regiments. A couple of decades later, a 5th regiment was added. Cossack state divided into regiments. So to the Sloboda, Ukraine, these 5 regiments which are marked on this map. And here, by the way, is the contemporary boundary of Ukraine. So this is an area that straddles both sides of northeastern Ukraine, which at the present is one of the worst parts of Ukraine to be in, since it's the focus of the war. In Sloboda, Ukraine, agriculture developed in these free villages, these slobodi, while a few towns evolved from the forts that functioned as the centers of the regiments. The largest of these towns was Kharkiv, had about 8,000 inhabitants in 1732, which made it a normal-sized urban area for that time. And Kharkiv eventually became the most important economic, educational, and cultural center for the entire Sloboda Ukraine. Just like in the Hetmanate, the Cossack state, the core of it, each regiment in Sloboda Ukraine had its own colonel, its staff of officers, the Cossack elite, the starshina that we have been speaking about. So each regiment had its own. But in contrast to other Cossack territories, that is the Hetmanate or Zaporozhye, the Sloboda colonels, regimental colonels, heads of the regiments, were elected for life. Moreover, the Muscovite government did not allow these regiments to be united under a higher office, for example, that of a hetman. Instead, each regiment was directly responsible to the central government in Moscow, specifically either to the Imperial Military Chancellery, from which each colonel received special orders, or to the Tsar's representative, a resident Muscovite or Russian voyevoda in the town of Belgorod, which was just north of the Sloboda Ukraine. Now, this kind of structure, for all intents and purposes, somewhat self-rule, local autonomy, left undisturbed until 1732. In that year, the imperial government under Empress Anna made the first attempt to dispense with Sloboda Ukraine's autonomous status. But there were protests, and then, as a result, Sloboda Ukraine won a temporary cancellation of these reforms. But the Russian government's long-term intentions, quite clear. Finally, according to an imperial manifesto issued in July 1765 by the new Russian imperial ruler, Empress Catherine II, and we're going to be encountering Catherine II throughout this entire discussion. Catherine II, she issues a decree, 1765, as a result of which the traditional Cossack regiments in Sloboda Ukraine were abolished, and instead were formed in each regiment a light cavalry, hussar or lancer, ulan regiment. The point being, with Catherine's manifesto of 1765, she effectively abolished the autonomous status of the Sloboda Ukraine, and in its stead created a unified Russian province, all the regiments made into one province called, actually, Sloboda Ukraine, ruled by a governor general appointed by the Tsar in Kharkiv. Despite some protests, Sloboda Ukraine, after 1765, became an integral part of the Russian Empire. The second of our territories, Zaporozhye, much more turbulent history than Sloboda Ukraine. Ultimate fate, however, the same. Full incorporation into the Russian imperial governmental structure. We know throughout our discussion of the 16th and 17th century in particular, the Zaporozhians traditionally favored alliances with Muscovy. We also saw how by the late 17th century, the late 1600s, the Zaporozhians began to be displeased with the policy of Muscovy's Tsars, their anti-Crimean wars, the Zaporozhians rightly suspecting that these wars would lead to an increase in the authority of the central government over all of southern Ukraine and eventually Crimea, and that would mean an end to the source of Cossack freebooting livelihood. And so, under their dynamic leader, a man named Kost Hordienko, which we have seen already, certainly during the period of Mazepa, under Hetman Hordienko, the Zaporozhians finally broke with Peter in 1709, allied themselves with Ivan Mazepa and his Swedish protector, King Charles XII. The Muscovites responded by destroying the Zaporozhian siege, forcing the Zaporozhians to leave and establish new headquarters in the Ottoman sphere, most specifically in the town of Oleksii on the borders of the Ottoman Empire, which we need to now look at in the form of another map. Here we have Oleksii down at the mouth of the Dnieper River within Ottoman territory, specifically the farthest western edge of the Crimean Khanate, where the Zaporozhians are now, quote-unquote, in exile. But, not surprisingly, Zaporozhians being Zaporozhians, independent-minded, soon they became dissatisfied with these new protectors of the Ottoman world, especially since as subjects of the Crimean Khan, they were cut off from trade with the Hetmanate on the one hand, and were forbidden, obviously, to raid their traditional source of booty, the Crimean Khanate. We're now in the 1730s. Russia making preparations for a new campaign against the Ottoman Empire, and was receptive to now negotiating with these discontent Zaporozhians, who are perhaps permanently discontent. Well, the result of these talks was an agreement signed at a town called Lubny in 1734. Hordienko dies in 1733, so he was always anti-Muscovy, so it made it easier for these negotiations. 1734, the Zaporozhians are able to regain all their former lands, which came to now be known as the free lands of the Zaporozhian host. And they were permitted to return and retain their traditional laws and customs. So here they are now in this vast territory of Zaporozhia, which now has the Zaporozhian Cossacks back. Actually, the number of Cossacks who returned from the Ottoman Empire, no more than 20,000. And so initially they had this vast territory at their disposal. And in an attempt to maintain a measure of control over this vast territory, they even introduced a more formal administrative structure, something Zaporozhians never did. But here they created 8 districts, or palanki, were formed throughout this vast territory so that they could have some kind of control over it. Aside from building, in a sense, an embryonic state administration, the Zaporozhians nevertheless remained concerned with the demographic and political vacuum in this extensive territory, and in therefore the potential for interference with their status by the Russian imperial government. Despite peasant refugees from Polish-controlled right bank Ukraine and left bank Hetmanate, resenting the increasing burdens of serfdom and therefore started to come to Zaporozhye. Despite that, by 1762, there were still only about 33,000 Cossacks and about 150,000 peasants in Zaporozhye. Muscovy, Russian Empire, determined to colonize this sparsely inhabited Zaporozhye with peasants from other parts of the empire. Since the Russian Empire, certainly under Catherine II, determined to integrate border regions of its increasingly far-flung realm. And as a result, during the 1750s, the imperial government, even before Catherine, initiated a colonization program to encourage an influx of new settlers who would be directly dependent on the central authorities. And the new settlers that they first got were from the Balkans, in particular Serbs from the Balkan region. And in fact, the Russian government organized a special territory at the far northern portion of Zaporozhye, which they called New Serbia. And then in 1754, the imperial government co-opted more Zaporozhian land all along the southern border of New Serbia to create a Cossack military region made up of about 6,000 Cossacks, but from Sloboda, Ukraine, and from the Hetmanate. So now we have another chunk of incursion into Zaporozhye. The Zaporozhians themselves resented the imperial Russian colonization of their northern frontier. They often clashed with the Serb colonists. But nonetheless, the Zaporozhians continued to serve faithfully with the imperial army in its wars against the Ottoman Empire in the 1730s and 1770s. Major wars actually took place, the last of the great major wars between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And in the context of Tsarist Russian policy as a whole, the eventual demise of Zaporozhian autonomy was inevitable. As I said, despite the pressure on their lands, the Zaporozhians continued to fight loyally and valiantly with the Tsarist forces in their campaign against the Ottomans during that last great war, Ottoman War of 1768 to 1774. Great last Russian-Ottoman Russo-Turkish War, as it was known. But at the same time that that war was going on, Russia's borderlands to the east of Ukraine were rocked by a series of revolts which seriously threatened Tsarist rule. Sporadic uprisings occurred in Zaporozhye as well, but it was among the Don and the Yayak Cossacks just to the east that large-scale revolts took place, culminating in the greatest uprising in 18th century Russia, the so-called Pugachev Rebellion. Great challenge to the young Catherine II. But she was able to put down the Pugachev Rebellion, and after that, Catherine was determined to reorganize all the borderlands so as to impose greater control over their inhabitants, not singling out Ukraine or Zaporozhye at all, concerned with all of these borderlands. Of course, Zaporozhye in particular became an area of concern because it was part of the southern border facing the Ottoman Empire. It's ironic that although the Zaporozhians had remained, as I said, staunchly loyal throughout the Great Russo-Turkish War, they were among the hardest hit by the new, more stringent Tsarist policy. And so, on the 4th of June, 1775, victorious Russian imperial troops returning from their Ottoman campaigns, the war ended in 74, on the way back, they suddenly attack and they destroy the Zaporozhian siege. Some of the Cossacks there were immediately pressed into Russian military service. Some were left as free farmers. Others sought protection in the Ottoman Empire, where they were allowed to settle near the mouth of the Danube River. So now once again, we have Cossacks in exile along this Danube River of all places. But that same year, 1775, most of Zaporozhia was annexed to a province which was called New Russia. We hear a lot about New Russia from the present rulers of the Russian Federation, as if this had always been forever and ever a Russian territory called New Russia. Well, that was just a term that was used and devised by Catherine II's rule and by her most favorite servitor, a prince, Grigory Potemkin. That's how New Russia came into being. New Russia, for all intents and purposes, was nothing but Zaporozhia, transformed into a Russian imperial province. By the way, this Potemkin was very eager to impress his sovereign. He began a dynamic colonizing program, bringing new settlers from various parts of Europe. And so this is when this whole area of southern Ukraine becomes very multicultural, if you will. Large numbers of Romanians from nearby Ottoman-ruled Moldavia, smaller groups of Armenians, Greeks from the Crimea, Bulgarians, Turks, Albanians from the Ottoman Empire. From farther afield came Italians, Corsicans, Danzigers, Swedes. Till the 20th century, there was a Swedish village in this middle of southern Ukraine on the steppes. Also, especially Germans. Catherine II herself was a German princess. Why go to Russia? Well, the colonists were attracted to the empire, and particular to New Russia, former Zaporozhia, by the free land and tax-exempt privileges, at least for the first 2 or 3 decades of their settlement, they were offered. As I said, Germans were especially favored, German colonists. They could be Roman Catholic, but especially Protestant Germans, and that including the Mennonites. This is when the Mennonites made their appearance in Ukraine. Ironically, their main center was Khortytsia Island in the middle of the Dnieper River, which was the first Zaporozhian Cossack siege created way back in the 16th century. Still, if you go there today, you will see remnants of all of these brick buildings that look like somewhere in Prussia. That actually is the result of the Mennonite presence that goes back to this period in the second half of the 18th century. The Germanic peoples took advantage of several Russian imperial decrees. More came in 1763, 1789, 1790. Followed an even greater number in the earlier part of the 19th century, where they founded numerous colonies along the Black Sea, and therefore in German literature, when speaking about Germanic peoples throughout various parts of Europe, these came to be known as the Schwarzmeerdeutsche, that is to say, the Black Sea Germans. With Empress Catherine's backing and encouragement, her official Potemkin also succeeded in establishing the basis for several new towns throughout New Russia and Crimea as well. These towns grew up around existing or reconstructed fortresses. Yelizavethrad, now Kropivnitsky, Katerinoslav, named after Catherine, today Dnipro in Zaporozhye. From the Ottoman Empire, places like Sevastopol in Crimea, Mariupol on the northern shores of the Sea of Azov, Mykolaiv, Kherson, all of these places that unfortunately we hear about today for the wrong reasons, since they are the butt of attacks by the Russians from the north. But it was actually after the death of Potemkin that the empire's most important Black Sea port was established in 1794. Catherine provided substantial funds to a soldier from Naples in southern Italy who was in the Russian service, a man named Admiral Joseph de Ribas, to create a harbor and settlement for a new city to be called Odessa. This de Ribas Neapolitan, assisted by several of his own family members and by other Italian merchants and entrepreneurs, who provided what became an ethnically diverse city with a distinct Italianate flavor. And it remains the great port on the Black Sea to this day. One has heard about a phrase that one necessarily doesn't know where it comes from. This Grigory Potemkin, Prince Potemkin, his undertakings often very costly, sometimes unproductive. His excesses were such that during Catherine's trip in 1787 to the recently acquired Crimea, so she's coming down from the north, from St. Petersburg, Potemkin was really anxious to impress her. And therefore, to impress her, to make it look like everything's really in order here, he hastily set up settlements all along her route through southern Ukraine, that is this new province of New Russia. But many of these buildings really were just facades. There was nothing behind them. So as the carriage passed by, it looked like it had all of this settlement. And that episode gave rise to the proverbial phrase Potemkin village. That is an illusory facade designed to cover an undesirable fact or condition. But in contrast to Potemkin's empty facades, Catherine's policy of administrative integration were actually quite real. In 1775, her government abolished the autonomy of Zaporozhye, just as it had abolished that of Sloboda, Ukraine 10 years before. And so, having transformed territory to its east and to its south into integral parts of the Russian Empire, Catherine was now ready to turn to the hetmanate, the third of our autonomous Ukrainian territories. Now, the hetmanate had the most highly developed form of autonomous self-government in Russian-ruled Ukraine. It was the direct successor to Khmelnytsky's Cossack state, going back to 1649. And at least until the end of Mazeppa's reign, the hetmanate maintained control over its internal affairs, even if it was subject to Muscovy with respect to foreign policy and military ventures. Now, as you can imagine, the status of the hetmanate was not helped, hardly helped by Mazeppa's defection to Sweden. In fact, in November 1708, immediately after learning of Mazeppa's defection, Peter arranged for the election of a new hetman, a man named Ivan Skoropadsky. As a personality, Skoropadsky was easy to manipulate, and he proved really to be no hindrance to Peter and Tsar Peter's plans. Among those plans, the Tsar did not reassert the articles of the Agreement of Pereyaslav of 1654, which was supposed to always happen every time there was a new hetman elected, nor did he negotiate any other agreement with the Cossacks that had previously been done whenever a new hetman was elected. Instead, Peter chose to just simply confirm a more limited number of traditional rights, but by his personal decree. Now, following the close of the Great Northern War with Sweden in 1721, Peter had an even greater opportunity to address Ukrainian affairs. Responsibility for the hetmanate, as part of his reforms, was changed in 1722 from the College of Foreign Affairs. It's very symbolic. So the hetmanate in relations was within the framework of foreign affairs of Muscovy. Now, in the Russian Empire, it's moved to the responsibility of the Senate because the Senate was concerned with the imperial's internal affairs. So the hetmanate is now not a foreign land, but an internal land of the Russian Empire. And that same year, in 1722, something called the Little Russian Collegium was established. The Little Russian Collegium. Well, what was that, this Little Russian Collegium? It was composed of 6 military or Russian military officers who were stationed in the hetmanate. This body of officers was commissioned with the following tasks. 1, to hear complaints lodged against local Cossack courts, and if necessary, to decide on those cases. 2, to control the financial affairs of the hetmanate. And 3, to intervene against the Stashina, the Cossack elite, and in its relations with the rank-and-file Cossacks and peasants. In effect, this Little Russian Collegium became a parallel government to the hetmanate. So we have the Cossack hetmanate and its administration, and then we have parallel to it the Little Russian Collegium, responsible directly to the Tsar. In fact, the hetmanate continued to be ruled now almost exclusively by the Little Russian Collegium. However, in 1726, under a new ruler, this was Empress Catherine I, not the second. By the way, the entire 18th century, when all of the success story in the growth of the Russian Empire was really carried out by women. This was the century of women. Virtually the whole session. After Peter I, there were just female rulers, almost to the end of the very end of the century. And so under Catherine I, plans now were made to restore the office of the hetman. And so in 1727, the Little Russian Collegium is abolished. Russian government arranged to have a new hetman, a man named Danilo Apostol, elected. And even allowed for the creation of a code consisting of 28 articles that was drawn up to regulate Imperial Russia's relationship with the hetmanate. This document, 1728, came to be known as the 28 Confirmed Articles. And according to the provision of these 28 confirmed articles, the hetmanate could not conduct any foreign affairs, although it could deal with Poland, Crimea, and the Ottoman Empire, purely border issues, though any agreements would have to have prior approval from the Russian imperial government. Now, from the standpoint of the Russian imperial government, these 28 confirmed articles actually were a step backward in what seemed to have been Imperial Russia's determined effort ever since Peter I to abolish the autonomous status of the hetman. But it wasn't long before St. Petersburg returned to more restrictive policies. But then, in the 1740s, the Imperial Russian government once again moves back from its anti-hetmanate policy. Here we have in history the role of the individual. Why did Russia step back? Well, largely owing to the role played by a certain person, the court favorite, and eventually the husband of the new empress, again, new ruler, another empress, another woman, Elizabeth, was a man named Oleksii Rozumovskyi. Oleksii Rozumovskyi. He was the son of a registered Cossack, well within the Cossack tradition. But because of his musical talent, he was a singer in the imperial choir. He happened to be handsome as well. That helped. He therefore came to Catherine I's attention. So much so then did this Rozumovskyi was able to interest Elizabeth in his homeland. As a result, the office of the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev, which was downgraded by Peter I, was now restored. And then in 1747, Rozumovskyi pushed through plans for the election of a new hetman. And the choice fell on his younger brother, Kirill Razumovskyi. One might ask how he could be doing these things. Well, he not only became the lover of the Empress, he became her husband. And so in 1747, we have these plans. And now his brother, Kirill Razumovskyi, a remarkably well-educated youth, as a result of his brother's connections, was made already president of the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. He was only 18 years old at the time. But then in 1750, Kirill was elected hetman of the hetmanate. This Kirill Razumovskyi, kind of 18th century intellectual dilettante par excellence, he was educated in France, in Italy, Germany, displayed the typical imperial Russian predilection, aristocratic predilection for Western culture. We know that the nobility in Russia, they all spoke French. They hardly knew Russian. And he tried to impose this outlook, that is Kirill Razumovskyi, on the hetmanate's capital in this little provincial town of Hluchiv up in the north, near the boundary with the rest of the empire. And so in this little provincial town of Hluchiv, he established an Italian opera, opened coffee houses, introduced French language schools, Parisian fashions, erected a Versailles-like hetman's palace. But despite these improvements, actually, not surprisingly, Razumovskyi preferred the imperial capital of St. Petersburg, where there was culture, instead of this provincial Hluchiv, no matter how much he tried to change it. Point is, during his long absences, the Cossack Starshina was left on its own to run the hetmanate affairs, and they even held periodic congresses, somewhat like noble diets. Actually, the Cossack Starshina, the elite, was helped in its efforts by the Imperial Russian government beginning in the 1730s, especially during the rule of Empress Anna and then another Tsar, Peter III, short-lived. The nobility, Russian nobility, was granted several privileges, including permanent exemption from state service. The hope of, why did the government do this? Well, they hoped that improving the status of the nobility, the nobles would pay more attention to the economic well-being of their landed estates. So leave St. Petersburg and go out into the country, be representatives of the imperial government. But in the end, the members of the Hetmanate Cossack Starshina proved themselves quite willing to go along with a system that guaranteed them so many privileges. Having laid the groundwork to attract the hetman's elite into Imperial Russia's social structure, the government in St. Petersburg could once again return to its policy of centralization. First came the office of the hetman. It was abolished in 1764, but now permanently. Rozumovskyi, who never really cared much for ruling in the hetmanate, easily placated with a new imperial title, the equivalent of a lavish pension, large estates in the town of Baturin in the hetmanate, where he finally settled in 1775, and he lived there comfortably until he died in 1783. So he was bought off. In his place, once again, a little Russian Collegium is restored, this time composed of 4 imperial appointees and 4 Cossacks, headed by a president named, a man named Count Rumyantsov. This Rumyantsov proceeded to set out on a policy of centralization, while at the same time giving landlords increasing land. He also legalized the landlords' control over their peasants. The reforms of this Rumyantsov, head of the restored little Russian Collegium, interrupted for a while in 1769 during that great war, the Russo-Turkish war. But after 5 years were over, Treaty of Kuchik-Kanaji signed with the Ottoman Empire. Russia received from the Ottoman Empire an enormous financial indemnity, acquired some Ottoman territory along the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. So all of these territories are now part of the Russian Empire. But most important, the Ottoman government recognized the independence of the Crimean Khanate. I mean, the Crimean Khanate had been a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. Now it recognizes its independence, however, an independent Crimea under Russian protection. As a result of this, further integration of the Hetmanate into the Russian Empire could proceed. Once again, this time for the last time, the little Russian Collegium abolished. The Hetmanate divided into 3 imperial provinces, which were really no different from any other provinces in the empire. Finally, in 1783, the peasants' freedom of movement was restricted. In other words, the process of encirclement completed. And that same year, the Cossack military system of regiments was abolished and replaced by 10 cavalry units of the imperial army. In effect, by the mid-1780s, the Cossack Hetmanate ceased to exist. Sloboda Ukraine, Zaporozhye, now the Hetmanate. Lastly, the Crimean Khanate. In contrast to Sloboda Ukraine, Zaporozhye, Hetmanate, that had been part of the Tsardom of Muscovy and then the Russian Empire, the Crimean Khanate was a sovereign political entity, a vassal within the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, any Russian advance on Crimea would first have to address the reality of Ottoman rule over much of the steppe lands north of the Black Sea. Now, even before Russia gained the upper hand in this region, the status of the Crimean Khanate had changed. By the outset of the 17th century, early 1600s, the Ottomans were playing an increasingly influential role in Crimean politics. They selected and deposed many of the state's ruling khans. No longer was the Crimea able to refuse what now became Ottoman orders to supply the Sultan with military forces. But as the fortunes of the Ottoman Empire itself declined, so did income for Crimea in the form of war booty, at best declined or dried up entirely. In fact, Russian military victories and international treaties put an effective end to the export of captives from its lands, thereby undermining the slave trade, which had been the mainstay of Crimea's economy. The culmination of all of these developments came with that Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774. Early in the conflict, Russia managed to gain the allegiance of the Nogai Tatars. You remember those Nogai Tatars who were kind of vassals of the Crimean Khan, but kind of independent. But now they become allies of Russia. And that meant the effective loss to the Khanate of lands beyond the peninsula itself. So this whole area where the Nogais are now allied with the Russian Empire. And then in 1770, the Khan himself and Crimea's most powerful clan decided to abandon their association entirely with the Ottomans and instead to pledge their loyalty to the sovereign of Russia, like Khmelnytsky in 1654. And that resulted in a treaty. We have the Agreement of Pereyaslav in 1654, Khmelnytsky and the Tsar. Now we have the Treaty of Karasu-Bazar, signed in 1772, as a result of which an independent Crimean state comes into being in 1772. But an independent state under the protectorship of the Russian Empire. The first years of independent Crimea were actually marked by internal struggle among those Crimean Tatars that were supporters of Russia or those who hoped for the return of the Ottomans. But Tsarist military intervention ended those controversies and allowed for the installation of a pro-Russian Khan, a man named Shahin Giray, very handsome, very talented, who also came to the attention of Catherine II, who adored him. But he had problems. He had problems in ruling the unruly Crimean nobles, many of whom wished for a return of the Ottomans, as I said. And when it became clear that this Khan Shahin was unable to control the uprisings against his regime, and when the Russian imperial government got tired of supporting an unpopular ruler, despite the fact that Empress Catherine liked him, nonetheless, politics are politics. In 1783, Catherine II issues a manifesto which unilaterally puts an end to the short-lived independent Crimean state and annexed it to the Russian Empire. So it comes into being in 1772. 11 years later, it ceases to exist. The lands of the Khanate in the peninsula of Crimea, as well as north of the Sea of Azov, were made part of a Russian administrative entity called Taurida. This transformation of the Crimean Khanate from an Ottoman to a Russian territory took place, as I said, during the reign of Empress Catherine II. As a result, she was credited, and rightly so, with the annexation of 1783, which made an enormously positive impression on the Russian public and the empire's allies abroad. She traveled there. Remember the story of Potemkin helping her trip. After all, it was Catherine II who finally fulfilled the age-old dream of Muscovite and Russian rulers, and it was she who achieved something which even the dynamic Peter I had failed to realize, and that was the acquisition of the Crimean Peninsula and most of the coastal region north of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. Of course, these lands hardly were ever part of Russia before. They only became part of the Russian Empire as late as 1783. And so to conclude, while the process of abolishing autonomy and self-rule may have taken somewhat longer in the Hetmanate and in the Crimean Khanate, because it wasn't until the 1780s, longer than it did in Sloboda, Ukraine, and Zaporozhye, the result was the same. One decade after another, Sloboda, Ukraine in the 1760s, Zaporozhye in the 1770s, finally the Hetmanate and Crimea in the 1780s, transformed with the result that autonomy on present-day Ukrainian territory located within the Russian Empire was eliminated. A system of administrative division into imperial provinces, each of those provinces directly responsible to the imperial capital in St. Petersburg, was put in place instead of these old, now autonomous regions. By the end of the 18th century, when Catherine finally expired in 1796, the government of Empress Catherine II had succeeded in making all Ukrainian lands under her rule an integral part of the Russian Empire. Thank you.